The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The trees swayed gently in the cool evening breeze, and all was quiet. At least, that was what Sergeant Mark Harris thought. He had been on patrol in the remote area for hours, waiting for any sign of trouble. But all he had seen were birds and the occasional squirrel, going about their business. Mark had no idea that this peaceful evening was about to change forever. It all started with a strange noise. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper in the wind. But as Mark listened more closely, it became clearer, louder. It sounded like something was falling from the sky. But this was no normal storm or gust of wind. No, this was something entirely different. A sudden flash of light illuminated the sky, followed by a loud crackling sound. Mark's heart raced. He immediately dropped to the ground and reached for his radio. He wanted to report this unusual event, but his voice caught in his throat. What if it was just some kind of malfunction in the nearby research station? Before he could finish that thought, the ground beneath him shook. The trees around him seemed to tremble as something big and heavy crashed nearby, sending dirt and debris flying into the air. Mark stood up, gripping his rifle, and sprinted toward the source of the sound. The crash site wasn't far. It only took a few minutes to reach it. As he pushed through the thick underbrush, the sight before him stopped him dead in his tracks. A spaceship, or at least something that looked like one, lay broken and smoking in the middle of the forest. The craft's exterior was unlike anything Mark had ever seen, sleek, shiny, and covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly. It had obviously crashed from a great height, and the damage was extensive. The ship's hull was twisted and cracked, parts of it scattered in pieces around the impact site. But what really caught Mark's attention was what lay nearby. Lying motionless on the ground, just outside the wreckage, was a figure. It was small, humanoid, but nothing like the people Mark had known. The body was slim and delicate, covered in strange, pale green skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The figure's face, though faintly human, had sharp features, high cheekbones, a long, narrow nose, and deep, almost otherworldly eyes. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Was this a person? An alien? His mind raced. Could this be some kind of extraterrestrial visitor? Theories about alien life had been floating around for decades, but this was real. And it was lying right in front of him, motionless and helpless. Mark's first instinct was to run. His heart pounded and his body froze. Could it be dangerous? Should he call for backup? But as he stood there, staring at the unconscious figure, something in him shifted. He had seen war. He had fought in battles, faced death countless times. But this felt different. There was no immediate threat, no weapon drawn, no signs of aggression. The figure was simply lying there, barely breathing. He couldn't just leave it. Not like this. Mark hesitated, his mind torn between fear and compassion. He had no idea how to approach the situation. What if this was some kind of trap? What if the alien, if that's what it was playing dead, only to strike when he got close? But something about the situation didn't sit right. There was an innocence in the alien's stillness. Taking a deep breath, Mark stepped closer, cautiously lowering his rifle. His hand reached out to touch the figure's shoulder, and a strange sensation ran through him. It was warm. Not just the heat of the forest, but a real, human warmth. He quickly pulled back, confused. How could it be warm if it wasn't human? The alien's eyes fluttered open, and Mark froze. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, neither moving. There was no sound, only the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The alien's large eyes were filled with confusion, fear, and pain. She tried to move, but her body was weak, and she let out a soft groan as if every part of her was aching. Mark didn't know what to do. He wasn't trained for this. He was a soldier, not a doctor. He didn't know how to help an alien, or even if he could help. But when the alien looked up at him with pleading eyes, He felt something stir deep inside. Without thinking, he reached into his pack and pulled out the last of his food rations. He hadn't planned on using it, but now seemed as good a time as any. He opened the package and held it out to her, his hands shaking. The alien's eyes fixed on the food. For a long moment, she just stared at it, almost as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. Then, with trembling hands, she reached forward and took it. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left him. Mark could see the hunger in her gaze, the desperation that came with starvation. As the alien began to eat, Mark sat down, watching her closely. He didn't know what to think. What was this creature? Where had she come from? And why was she so desperate? Mark had so many questions, but as he watched the alien eat, he realized one thing was certain. The world, his world, would never be the same again. Mark stayed in his crouched position, watching the alien woman as she carefully ate the small ration of food. His mind raced with a million questions. Where was she from? Why had she come here? And what did her people want? The fact that she had fallen from the sky, like some kind of comet, only deepened the mystery. Her skin shimmered faintly under the light of the fading sun, a pale green color that almost seemed unnatural. Mark couldn't help but stare at her. He had always believed in the possibility of alien life, but seeing it so close, seeing it so real, was something he could never have prepared for. The alien woman's hands trembled as she ate, and Mark noticed a faint bruise on one of her arms. She was clearly weak. Her clothes were tattered, covered in dirt, and scorch marks from the crash. Whatever had brought her to this place, it had clearly been an ordeal, and she hadn't been treated kindly. Mark couldn't help but feel pity for her, and yet a part of him still held his guard up. She could be dangerous after all. What if she was a scout sent to infiltrate humanity, to learn about them before a full-scale invasion? What if this was just a trick? But as she ate, there was no aggression in her eyes, no malice, only hunger, desperation, and as she looked up at him, a hint of something else. Trust, or perhaps it was just the result of being in such a vulnerable position. Mark cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly, almost hoping for an answer. The alien woman stopped eating for a moment, her eyes darting to his. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she made a soft, guttural sound, a sort of low hum, and her eyes filled with tears. Mark froze, unsure of how to respond. Her shoulders trembled, and for a moment, Mark thought she might collapse right there. But then, in a quiet voice that barely registered above the wind, she spoke. "Help. Me." Mark didn't know what to say. She was speaking English, or at least something he could understand. Her voice was fragile, as if she hadn't used it in a long time. Whatever had happened to her, it had drained her. She was no longer the imposing, mysterious alien he had imagined. She was just a woman, sick, starving, and in need of help. Mark hesitated for a moment longer, and then he made a decision. This was no longer about the mission, about keeping the forest safe. This was about helping someone in need, someone who had no reason to trust him but did anyway. "We'll get you out of here," Mark promised, his voice gentle. He could see her visibly relax at his words, and she nodded weakly. Her trembling hands reached out for more of the food, and Mark quickly gave her the rest of his rations. She devoured it as if she hadn't eaten in days. Maybe she hadn't. Mark stood up slowly, his rifle still slung across his back. He didn't know how to move forward. His first instinct was to report everything to command, to get back up and bring in experts who could assess the situation. But he also knew that would mean leaving her alone, leaving her vulnerable. If he left her, who knew what might happen next? Without a clear plan, he made a snap decision. "Come on," he said, offering her his hand. "We need to get to my truck. We'll figure out the rest later." The alien woman looked at his hand for a moment, and then, with some hesitation, she reached out and took it. Her fingers were cool to the touch, and Mark could feel a slight tremor in her grasp. She was stronger than she appeared, but she was still weak, and she needed help. They began walking together, carefully making their way through the forest. Mark kept a wary eye on their surroundings, listening for any sounds of danger. He didn't trust the silence, not when so much was unknown. Could there be more aliens out there? More ships? What had brought her here, and why? As they walked, Mark tried to make small talk to ease the tension, though he wasn't sure how much she could understand. "I'm Mark, by the way. What's your name?" he asked, his voice soft. She didn't respond at first, and for a moment, Mark thought she might not have understood him. But then, as they came to a clearing, she stopped and turned to him. Her gaze was intense, and her lips parted as if she were trying to say something important. "My name," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Azaria." The name sent a shiver down Mark's spine. It didn't sound like anything he had ever heard before. It sounded ancient, almost as though it carried weight, as if it held a deep history, a secret he wasn't yet ready to understand. Before Mark could ask more, the rustling of leaves caught his attention. Something was moving through the trees. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He instinctively reached for his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. Azaria's eyes widened, and she clutched his arm tightly. Mark didn't move. The sound was getting closer. Whatever it wasn't friendly. The two of them were exposed, vulnerable in the open, and there was no way to know who or what was coming. In that moment, the mystery deepened. Whatever had brought Azaria here, it was far from over. And Mark was about to find out just how deep the unknown truly went. Mark's senses were on high alert. His grip on the rifle tightened as he scanned the area. The rustling from the trees had stopped, but the air felt charged, as if something dangerous was drawing closer. He could feel Azaria's grip on his arm tightening, her fingers cold and trembling, but there was no time to comfort her now. He had to think quickly. "Stay close to me," Mark whispered, keeping his voice low, almost as if speaking too loudly would draw whatever was out there closer. Azaria nodded, her wide, fearful eyes flicking around as she followed his movements. Mark's eyes darted between the shadows of the trees, his ears straining to catch any sign of movement. He had been trained to react to situations like this, to hunt down the threat before it could strike. But this wasn't a normal situation. This was something else. He had no idea what they were up against. The forest was eerily silent now, too silent. The normal sounds of wildlife, the chirping of birds and the rustling of smaller creatures, had all but disappeared. That wasn't natural. Whatever had been following them had caused every creature to retreat. The stillness was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. Mark glanced back at Azaria. She seemed even more on edge now, her body tense, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Her earlier fragility was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper. It was as if she had become attuned to the danger, as though her own instincts had kicked in. "I don't know how much longer we can keep moving," Mark muttered to himself, more out of frustration than actual worry. They needed to get to his truck, but the path was blocked by thick underbrush, and the distant sounds of their unseen pursuers seemed to be closing in. If they stayed where they were, they would be easy targets. If they ran, they might never make it. Azaria shifted her weight, as if considering her options. She stepped closer to Mark and placed her hand on his shoulder, something entirely unexpected. Her touch was warm, and Mark could feel the strange sense of comfort she was offering, even in the midst of danger. It made no sense, but in that moment, it was all he had. "I can help you," Azaria said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension surrounding them. Mark looked at her in surprise. He wasn't sure how she could help, but her confidence seemed genuine. "How?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his instincts screamed at him to keep moving. Azaria looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a strength he hadn't noticed before. "I know who is coming, and I know how to stop them," she said with an air of finality. Mark blinked. He wasn't sure what to make of her words. How could she possibly know what was coming, and how could she stop them? Her people had just arrived on Earth, and they didn't seem like the kind of species that would be easily intimidated. But there was something in her eyes, something deep, a glint of knowledge and power that wasn't typical for someone in her condition. She had seen something. She had survived something. And now Mark was starting to think that she might know more than he could ever imagine. Before Mark could respond, the faint sound of movement grew louder again. This time, it wasn't from the trees. It was from the ground. The dirt beneath Mark's boots began to tremble, subtly at first, then more violently. He looked down and saw the earth shifting, like something massive was crawling beneath the surface. The ground rumbled like a distant earthquake, and a sharp crack sounded in the trees behind them. Something, or someone, was closing in fast. Without thinking, Mark grabbed Azaria's hand and started to run, pulling her along behind him. The forest blurred past them as they raced toward the clearing where his truck was parked. Every step felt like a race against time, and Mark could hear the ominous vibrations of whatever was pursuing them, gaining on them with every passing second. Azaria kept pace with him effortlessly, despite the fact that she had been in such a weak state just moments ago. Her feet barely made a sound as they sped through the dense forest, her steps eerily quiet but purposeful. It was as if she was no longer the fragile alien he had found starving in the woods, but something far more dangerous. And just as quickly, Mark realized how little he truly knew about her. "What's happening?" Mark panted, not daring to look behind him. "Their ships are buried beneath the surface," Azaria replied, her voice calm, but there was a certain dread in her tone. "We're not just being hunted, we're being tracked." Mark's heart pounded harder. Tracked by what? Azaria didn't answer immediately. She could see the fear on his face. She could feel it in the air. But instead of speaking, she gave him a hard look, as though she was preparing him for something he wasn't ready for. Her voice was low, nearly a whisper. "Their technology is ancient, but advanced. They're not just using sensors to track us. They're using our emotions, our fear. They know exactly where we are." Mark's blood ran cold. The thought of something so powerful, so invasive, made his stomach churn. They weren't just dealing with technology beyond their understanding. They were up against something that could literally feel their fear, use it to find them. It was beyond anything he had imagined. The ground continued to shake as they moved, and now Mark could hear the distinct sound of something massive crashing through the trees, getting closer with every second. It was too late to run. The only option left was to face whatever was coming, and pray that Azaria's mysterious knowledge was enough to stop them. Mark's heart raced as the ground trembled beneath his feet. The deafening rumble grew louder, drowning out everything else. Trees shook violently, their branches snapping like brittle twigs, and the air grew heavy with tension. Every instinct in Mark screamed at him to run faster, but his legs felt like lead. Whatever was out there, it was closing in fast. Azaria's hand remained firm around his wrist, pulling him forward with surprising strength. She had become a different person since the moment he found her. Gone was the fragile, starving alien. Now she was a determined force, guiding him through the chaos, as if she had known exactly what would happen. Mark glanced over his shoulder. The shadows of the forest seemed to twist, the trees bending unnaturally as something massive moved just beneath the surface. The sounds weren't coming from the trees anymore. It was something much more threatening, much more predatory. Whatever it was terrifyingly close. "There," Azaria shouted, pointing ahead. "We need to reach the clearing." Mark didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, faster than he thought possible, dragging Azaria with him. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he couldn't stop. The fear in Azaria's eyes was enough to keep him moving. They reached the edge of the forest, the clearing just ahead. The truck was parked 100 yards away, but the landscape around them had changed. The once familiar trees now seemed like distorted silhouettes, and the air was thick with an unsettling energy. It was as if the entire forest had been warped by whatever was coming. Behind them, the ground exploded in a violent tremor. Mark didn't dare turn around, but the vibrations were so intense, he could feel the shockwaves in his chest. Whatever was coming, whatever was chasing them, was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was here. And then, as though the earth itself had split open, a massive shape emerged from the forest. Mark stumbled back in shock. It wasn't a creature, not in the way he had expected. It was a ship, a colossal, jagged thing that seemed to claw its way out of the ground, massive engines pulsing with dark energy. The alien vessel was sleek but menacing, its surface covered in strange, glowing symbols that flickered like dying stars. It was unlike any ship Mark had ever seen before. It looked ancient, yet impossibly advanced, as though it had been buried for centuries, waiting to awaken. A massive door on the ship's side opened with a loud mechanical groan, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. Standing there in the doorway was something he could only describe as a nightmare come to life. The alien who emerged was tall, towering even by human standards. Its skin was a dark, almost metallic blue, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural, chilling light. Its face was elongated, with sharp features that seemed to defy the laws of biology. A deep hum filled the air as the alien moved toward them, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Azaria stepped forward, her expression hardening. Mark froze, his blood running cold. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary alien. "This is not what you think," Azaria said, her voice carrying an unsettling calm. She turned to Mark, her eyes meeting his. "They've been watching us for a long time. You have no idea what they are capable of." The towering alien stopped in front of them, its cold gaze flicking from Mark to Azaria. Mark felt an overwhelming pressure in the air, like the alien was somehow reading him, understanding him, without saying a word. "Azaria." The alien's voice echoed in Mark's mind. It wasn't spoken aloud, but the words were unmistakable. "I thought you were lost, but it seems you found new allies." Mark's pulse quickened. The alien's voice was in his mind, not his ears, and it felt like it was probing his thoughts. It was an invasion, but he couldn't stop it. He was powerless in the face of this alien's presence. Azaria's expression remained unchanged. "I'm not your prisoner anymore," she said firmly. "And neither is he." The alien's eyes narrowed. "You are wrong. You are both playing a dangerous game, one you cannot win. You cannot hide from the truth forever." A chill ran down Mark's spine. He had no idea what the alien meant, but the words struck him deep. Azaria seemed unfazed, but Mark felt a strange pull toward her. She had known this alien, or at least something about it. She had been hiding something from him. And now, it seemed like everything was coming to light. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," the alien continued, its voice growing darker. "The one who finds the ancient language will awaken powers that even we cannot control." Mark looked at Azaria, his confusion mounting. What was this alien talking about? What ancient language? And why was Azaria the key to it all? Before he could ask, Azaria turned to face him, her eyes hard with determination. "We need to go. Now." The alien didn't move to stop them. Instead, it stood silently, watching as Mark and Azaria made their way toward the truck. Mark's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had just happened. What had Azaria meant by the ancient language? What did it have to do with this alien? And why was it so intent on stopping them? But there were no answers, not yet. Only the unsettling knowledge that something far larger than them was at play, and they had just become its pawns. Mark's heart raced as he climbed into the truck, his fingers trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. Azaria was already in the passenger seat, her face pale, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the world around her. The alien's words echoed in his mind. "The one who finds the ancient language will awaken powers that even we cannot control." What did that mean? Was Azaria the key to this ancient language? And why was she so important to the aliens? Mark could feel the weight of those questions pressing down on him, but he had no answers. All he knew was that they had to get out of there, fast. Without a word, he turned the key, and the truck roared to life. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, sending the vehicle speeding down the winding road. Azaria didn't speak, her gaze fixed forward. But Mark could feel her tension radiating from her. She knew something that could change everything, but she wasn't telling him. Not yet. The landscape blurred around them, the world moving too quickly as they raced toward the unknown. The clearing they had fled from now seemed like a distant memory, but Mark knew that wasn't the end. That wasn't the end of anything. The alien's words haunted him. You cannot hide from the truth forever. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. What truth? The truth about Azaria. The truth about the ancient language. He glanced at her, her face still set in a determined expression, but there was something else there too. Fear, guilt. Finally, he couldn't take it any longer. He slammed his fist on the dashboard. Azaria, what's going on? What do they want from us? Azaria flinched, her head snapping to look at him. Her eyes were wide, but they quickly hardened again. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get stuck in her throat. Please, Mark said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I don't know what's going on, but I can't do this without you. I can't fight whatever this is if you won't tell me what's really happening. There was a long, painful silence. The sound of the truck's engine was the only thing that filled the space between them. And then, just as Mark was about to give up, Azaria spoke. The language, she began softly, her voice trembling slightly. It's not just a language. It's a weapon. Mark's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. A weapon? What kind of weapon? Azaria's gaze flicked to him, her expression haunted. The kind that can reshape entire civilizations. The kind that can alter the course of history. The kind that can bring entire races to their knees. Mark swallowed hard. This wasn't what he expected. A language that could control civilizations. That was far beyond anything he could understand. And yet, Azaria was sitting here beside him, a part of it all. The aliens, Azaria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. They've been searching for the language for centuries. They believe it holds the key to ultimate power, but only a human can unlock it. Mark's heart skipped a beat. A human. What does that have to do with you? You're not human. Azaria's eyes softened for a moment, but then they turned cold. I'm not, but I was, born to carry it. I've been trained my whole life to understand the language, to protect it, but I never wanted to use it. I never wanted this kind of power. Mark shook his head, trying to process what she was saying. But the aliens, they want you to use it. Azaria nodded slowly, her fingers curling into a tight fist. Yes, they believe that if they can control the language, they'll control everything. The galaxy, the universe. But She paused, her voice quivering. I can't let that happen. I won't let them use me to destroy everything. Mark's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything she was saying. It felt like they were standing at the edge of something massive, something they couldn't possibly understand. But there was one thing he knew for sure. Azaria was at the center of it all. The ancient language, the aliens, the power, it all seemed to lead back to her. Then what do we do? Mark asked, his voice urgent. How do we stop them? Azaria looked out the windshield, her eyes narrowing, as if searching for something far ahead. We have to find the key, the final piece of the language. Without it, they won't be able to control it. But we can't do it alone. We need help. Help, Mark repeated, his mind still struggling to catch up. From who? Azaria hesitated for a moment, then glanced at him. From the humans who've already unlocked parts of it. Mark's stomach churned. What do you mean? Who else knows about this? Azaria turned her gaze back to the road ahead, her expression hardening. The humans who've been working with the aliens, they've been using the language for their own gain. They don't care about the consequences. They only care about power. Mark's mind was spinning. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And the more he learned, the more dangerous it seemed. "We have to find them first," Azaria said, her voice resolute, "before the aliens do." Mark nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a dark cloud. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but one thing was clear: the world as he knew it was about to change forever. As they drove on, the silence between them grew heavy. They were no longer just running from the aliens. They were running toward something far more dangerous, the secret of the ancient language and the power it held. But the deeper they went, the more they realized that they might not be the only ones hunting for the key, and if they didn't find it first, the consequences could be catastrophic. The truck continued to barrel down the road, the sound of its tires against the cracked pavement a constant reminder of the time slipping away. Mark's thoughts raced as the weight of Azaria's revelation sank deeper into his chest. The ancient language, a weapon capable of reshaping the universe, and Azaria was at the center of it all. He glanced over at her, but her face was hard again, her eyes cold and distant. She wasn't the same person she had been when they first met. The burden of her knowledge, of the responsibility she carried, was too much for anyone to bear, let alone someone like her, someone who had never wanted power in the first place. "Where are we headed?" Mark finally asked, his voice low, though it didn't disguise the desperation that had been building up inside him since they left the alien base. Azaria hesitated for a moment before she answered, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "To a safe house, a place where I can connect with others who might still be able to help." They'd been hiding in plain sight for years. People who know more about the language than anyone else. "Why haven't you told me about them before?" Mark asked, his frustration creeping into his tone. Azaria's jaw tightened. "Because I didn't want to get you involved in this mess. It was my problem, not yours." But now, she trailed off, her voice softening for just a moment. Now it's too late. Mark didn't know what to say. He didn't know if she was pushing him away or just trying to protect him. Either way, it hurt. But he couldn't dwell on that now. They didn't have the luxury of time. As they continued driving, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The world around them seemed to grow darker, the tension rising in the air like a storm about to break. Mark could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going like this. Suddenly, Azaria's voice cut through the silence. "We're being followed." Mark's eyes snapped to her. "What?" She nodded, her expression grim. "I don't know who they are, but they've been tailing us for the last 10 miles. Whoever it is, they don't want us getting to that safe house." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't afford to get caught now. Not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. Not when they had to stop the aliens from using the language. "Do you think it's the aliens?" he asked, his mind racing with possibilities. Azaria shook her head. "No, the aliens wouldn't be so obvious. Whoever is following us is human, but that doesn't make them any less dangerous." Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he scanned the rearview mirror. The truck's headlights reflected off the dust in the air, but there was nothing unusual behind them. He couldn't see anything out of place, but Azaria's instincts were sharper than his. She wouldn't have said anything that she wasn't sure. "What do we do?" Mark asked, his voice tight. Azaria took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the road ahead. "We keep going, but we don't stop. Not until we get there." Mark didn't hesitate. He pressed down on the accelerator, the truck surging forward. They needed to get to the safe house, and they needed to do it fast. But as they pushed further down the road, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Every turn, every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, but they couldn't afford to stop and check. Minutes passed like hours, the oppressive silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. The weight of their situation hung over them, the knowledge that they were being hunted pushing them to the brink. Mark could feel the tension rising, the urgency pulling at him with every beat of his heart. And then, just as they approached a sharp bend in the road, a flash of headlights appeared in the distance. It was too bright, too close. Mark's pulse quickened as he realized the truck was gaining on them. Azaria's voice came out in a low, urgent whisper. "They're getting closer." "Hold on," Mark gritted out, his eyes locked on the road ahead. The truck was nearly upon them now, closing the gap with terrifying speed. He swerved to the left, taking the sharp turn that would hopefully throw their pursuers off. The truck screeched as its tires skidded across the gravel, but Mark kept his foot on the gas. He could feel the weight of the other vehicle behind them, its presence pressing down on him like a vice. But no matter how hard he drove, it seemed the vehicle behind them was never far behind. Mark's grip on the wheel tightened, sweat beading on his forehead. He needed to shake them off. He needed to get to the safe house before they were caught. And then, just as the truck behind them was about to close the gap, a sudden explosion rocked the road ahead. The ground trembled beneath them, and a huge fireball erupted in the distance. "What the hell was that?" Mark shouted, his heart racing. Azaria didn't answer. Her eyes were wide, her hands gripping the dashboard. "It's them. They've set a trap." Mark's stomach churned. The alien allies, whoever they were, had anticipated their every move. They had set a trap on the very road they were trying to escape on. They weren't just being followed, they were being hunted. Mark's mind spun as he fought to maintain control of the truck. The world around them seemed to slow down, the looming threat of their pursuers making every moment feel like an eternity. He wasn't sure how long they could keep this up, but one thing was clear. If they didn't find a way to shake their pursuers soon, they would never reach the safe house. The trap had been set, and now they were caught in the middle of it. The truck sped through the rugged terrain, swerving around tight corners and skidding on the loose gravel. The sound of their tires against the rough road echoed in Mark's ears as he pushed the vehicle to its limits. The explosion ahead had left him rattled, but there was no time to waste. Every second they spent on this road could mean their capture. Azariah had gone eerily silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her lips pressed into a tight line. Mark couldn't help but wonder what was running through her mind. Was she blaming herself for this? For dragging him into this mess? "Azaria, we're almost there, right?" Mark asked, his voice strained with exhaustion. She didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long pause, she finally spoke. "Yes, just a little further." The truck hit another bump in the road, and Mark's knuckles widened around the steering wheel as he pushed the accelerator harder. They couldn't stop, not yet. Not when they were so close to safety. The fireball from the explosion was still fresh in their minds. It had been a warning, a message. Whoever was after them wasn't playing around. They would do anything to stop them from reaching the safe house, to keep the knowledge of the ancient language from getting into the wrong hands. Mark's heart pounded harder as the lights of the safe house finally came into view. He could see the distant glow of a small building tucked into the hillside, surrounded by trees and hidden from view. They were almost there, almost safe. But as they neared the entrance, a familiar vehicle appeared in their rearview mirror, a sleek black car, its headlights cutting through the night like a predator on the hunt. Mark's pulse spiked as he realized their pursuers weren't giving up that easily. They had followed them this far, and they weren't going to stop now. "Azaria, they're still behind us," Mark said, his voice tense with urgency. "What do we do?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes were scanning the road ahead, her mind clearly calculating the best course of action. It wasn't like her to hesitate, but this time, the situation was different. Whoever was after them knew exactly where they were going, and they were closing in fast. Azaria's voice was calm, almost too calm. "We make a stand." Mark's stomach churned. A stand? Against who? He didn't have the resources to fight back, not when they were outnumbered and outgunned. But Azaria's resolve was unshakable. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She was a warrior, and she was prepared to fight for her life. He steered the truck into a sharp turn, bringing them closer to the hidden entrance of the safe house. The truck groaned as it skidded on the dirt road, but Mark didn't slow down. Not now. They were so close. He just needed to get them inside before the pursuers caught up. The black car followed suit, tailing them like a shadow, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Mark's heart raced as he pulled the truck into a narrow driveway. The safe house was surrounded by thick trees, the entrance barely visible from the road. He parked the truck behind the structure, hoping that the darkness would keep them hidden for just a few more minutes. Azaria was already out of the truck before it came to a complete stop. She moved quickly, her body tense and alert. Mark followed her, his boots hitting the ground with a thud as they both approached the entrance of the safe house. "Come on," Azaria said, her voice low but urgent. "We don't have much time." They moved swiftly into the safe house, and Azaria quickly locked the door behind them. The small building was cold and dimly lit, with only a few lamps flickering in the corners. It didn't look like much, but to Mark, it was the first real place they'd been able to rest in what felt like an eternity. Azaria walked over to a desk in the corner, pulling open a drawer and rifling through papers and old files. Mark took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the room as he tried to process everything that had happened. The explosions, the chase, the alien technology, the ancient language. Everything had come crashing down on them so suddenly, and now they were here, in this small, secluded place. But as Azaria searched through the papers, Mark's gut twisted with unease. There was something off about this place. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the longer they stayed here, the more unsettled he became. Finally, Azaria stopped, pulling out a small weathered book from the drawer. She held it up in front of her, and Mark saw the title written in a language he didn't recognize. The language. The ancient language. Azaria's eyes were filled with determination, but there was something else. Something dark, something hidden in her gaze. She turned to Mark, her face unreadable. "This is it," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "This is the key to everything. The language. It's the only thing that can stop them from destroying everything we know." Mark nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he took the book from her. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried the weight of centuries of forgotten history. But just as he was about to open it, a noise came from outside. Footsteps. Approaching. Azaria's expression shifted from determination to fear. "They'd found us." Mark's heart sank. They were not safe. Not yet. And now, they had to face whatever came next. Whatever betrayal lurked in the shadows. And in that moment, Mark realized something even more terrifying. This safe house wasn't the sanctuary they had hoped for. They had walked straight into the heart of the enemy's trap. The room seemed to close in on them. As Mark and Azaria exchanged a glance, there was no turning back now.